now that my bakes and my component UVs are all set up for the actual components, then I want to just go through and make sure that I have everything I need to get these into UE4 and finish them up. So all I'm doing is I'm going through and deleting any pieces that might be using the incorrect UV set now, because I want all of my UV sets to be named UV1 and UV2. I'm just going through and renaming any pieces like decal UVs or anything like that to be using either UV1 or UV2, because I don't want a UV set called texture when I do my export, because what it will do is if I have texture UV1, UV2, then it means I actually have 3 UV sets, and then the shaders will be looking for the wrong UV set. So all I'm doing now is I'm just going through all of these pieces, quickly making sure that any UVs that are sort of legitimately using the texture UV set, that I copy paste them over into the correct UVs, and then I just delete that UV set. So it's just a little bit of cleanup. I thought rather than deleting this footage, I would include it just to show that there are, like for me, I do hit plenty of little roadblocks that might cause problems in my shaders. So I still kind of have to go through cleanup every so often just to make sure that I'm not causing problems for myself. So it's kind of like no amount of practice can stop you from making small mistakes like this. So I'm just going through and making sure that anything that's using texture is now UV1 or UV2. So all of the bodywork, for example, right now would just be using UV2 because it's just its tiling materials. So you can see now that I've fixed the UVs on these pieces, that they should be loading the correct kind of normal maps and things like that. And now I need to go through and just make sure that the decals are just using the correct UV sets. So when I name the UV set correctly, then it should hopefully grab the correct UV set in the shader. But you can see that on the decal when I exported it, even though the texture set was named correctly, when it exported it was still a single UV set, so it still saw it as UV1. So I needed to make sure I included UV1 so that it knew to look for the second texture set so that the shader would work correctly. So once you get around making sure that this complexity kind of isn't causing little problems like this, then it becomes super powerful. So all I'm doing now is kind of setting up my shaders to make sure that they're using the correct UV sets now, because I know that UV2 on all of my texture sets is actually going to be the UV set I want to see all of my albedos and stuff tiling properly. It can be a little bit confusing in UE4 because your texture coordinates are named 0, 1, 2. So 0 is your first UV set, 1 is your second UV set, 2 is your third UV set, and so on. So it can be easier in your package to also name them 0, 1, 2, just to make sure that there's less confusion. I think because I do this quite often, then I just typically name them 1, 2, 3, just because then I know what UV sets they are. So now all I'm doing is I'm creating a material that's got the correct kind of things applied to it so that I can see that it works properly. And then I'm saying, okay, maybe I want some areas to be the same kind of hardware material, but I might want to tint them differently so that harder areas like the frame on the side of the camera might be darker than lighter areas that might be like softer materials. So like the camera and the sides of the gun and things like that might be one a little bit lighter than some of the hardware that holds them in place. So I'm just sort of testing this to make sure that I'm kind of happy with my own sort of thought process in Modo. And then I'll apply that in UE4 in a second. So you can see these pieces here, I'm thinking that they're a slightly different shader to the pieces underneath. And that's again because I kind of want that material to look very slightly different. So I don't want all of my components to be on the same materials. And you can see that these orange pieces they're using the same component textures, so they're using the same component normal and component AO, but instead of being painted metal, then they'll be more kind of like chrome, like you would see on hydraulics. So now I'm just exporting it into UE4 to see if I'm happy. So what I need to do is basically set up my UE4 shader now. So what I'm doing is I'm converting these into parameters so that these can easily be replaced with whichever textures I want when I plug them in, because I'm going to need to use this shader 3 times now. So I'm going to need to use it for painted components, metal components, and then maybe like slightly darker painted components. But you can see that all I'm doing is I'm using a normal that's applied to UV1 and I'm blending it with a normal that's applied to UV2. And then I just test it out, have a look at it in UE4 just to make sure it's working correctly. And now I'm thinking I want to have the control to be able to tint my UV map to make it darker. And then I'm going to convert this piece into a parameter so that then when I instance these shaders later, then I can go in and just change whichever parameters I want to make some things darker, change materials and things like that, for example. I'm just going to do exactly the same thing again now, where I just want to be able to adjust my roughness up and down. So you can see the pieces in the background getting quite glossy. So I just want to sort of set up a default value that looks quite good. And that's because this is my base components shader. And then this shader will be duplicated multiple times. So you can see I'm duplicating it. So I'm creating an instance of it. And this one will be applied to my metal. So I just kind of keep adjusting my shaders until I'm happy with how they work. So now you can see that if I look at my metal component shader, then I'm able to go in and just swap out all of these textures. So now I can see that instead of it using painted metal like it was before, now it's using the metal that I set up in DDO. But you can see it's also still using the normal and AO on the hinges of the actual hydraulics that I wanted. So now I'm just doing my components. So these bits are the ones that I want to tint because I want to make them look slightly darker, like they're more kind of harder metal that's used to just hold things in place, and then maybe the gun, things like that, are using kind of a softer, maybe even plastic that's been painted. So it's just giving me some slight variation to the roughness and the color all over the asset. So then that's why I have this basic component which is going to go on the gun and the camera. So once I've done this, then I'm just going to go into Modo and I'm just going to reduce the amount of meshes so that this is all set up correctly, and then I can finish up the bodywork of the drone.